Welcome to the desk lectures. This is just going to be where I talk and opine, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, maybe 90 minutes. I don't know. But today I want to talk about the handle. I want to start where I think every honest conversation about identity has to start. And that's not about the framework or a definition, but with a confession. For a significant portion of my life, I was very good at being someone I was not. And I want to be precise about what I mean because I'm not talking about deception in the ordinary sense. I was not consciously performing. I was not putting on a show I knew was false. The more unsettling truth is that I had lived inside the performance long enough that I had almost entirely lost the distinction between the costume and the person wearing it. See, that's the particular kind of bondage I want to talk about today, not the obvious kind, where a person knows that they're faking it. The invisible kind, where the mask has been on so long that when someone asks you who you are, you describe the mask. You describe what you do. You describe your history, your relationships, your roles, and you call that an answer, and it almost is, except that it leaves out the one thing that actually matters. I grew up in an environment where identity was largely relational and conditional. And that's not unusual. I mean, most people did, right? There were things that made you accepted and things that made you less so. And you learn that to calculate that early, right? You learn which version of yourself produces safety and which produces friction or fear, and you stop asking whether that is, that calculation is true. You just start operating inside of it. For me, the primary mask was performance, achievement. The idea that if I could stay ahead, stay sharp, stay impressive, stay useful, I had earned the right in that sense then to exist in the room without feeling insignificant. I want you to hear that carefully, okay? Not the right to be celebrated, the right to exist. That is how deep it went. The baseline was you have to justify your presence. And the justification? Output. What that produces over time is a person who is very functional and very absent at the same time, yet thought they were very present. I could deliver, lead, produce, but there was this slight distance always between the version of me that was moving through the world and something quieter underneath it that I kept not quite arriving at, a frequency, if you want to use that language, that I kept almost touching and then moving away from because there was always another thing to produce. The turning point when it came was not dramatic. It rarely is dramatic. It was not a breakdown. It was more like a moment of clarity that I almost missed. And I was sitting in a space of relative stillness, which I did not allow myself very often. As a matter of fact, it was forced upon me by health and depression. But I had this simple, undeniable awareness. I do not know what I actually want. Not in the surface sense. I had goals, plans, but underneath those, in the place where real desire lives, I could not locate anything that belonged to me. And everything I was pursuing had been borrowed from someone else's definition of success, from culture, expectation, the fear of what it would mean to stop. And that moment didn't fix anything, at least immediately. But it cracked something open because once you see that the life you're living is primarily an inherited performance rather than a genuine expression, you really can't unsee it. You can't go back. You can't stick it back in the box. And then the question becomes, is there something underneath? And if there is, how do you find it? And if you find it, how do you live from it? See, that question is one I've been working on since. It is the question that produced everything I'm going to share with you today and everything I share in the future. It is not a question I answered once and moved on. It's like, yep, got it. It's the question that reorganized my entire understanding of what freedom actually is. Because here's what I learned. Freedom is not about what you are allowed to do. It is about who is doing the doing. A person can have enormous external freedom and still be completely bound if the person making the decisions is not actually the person. Okay, we'll clarify soon. Some of you think James is going crazy. Nah, been there a long time. But most people, when they're honest about it, recognize that gap. Not the gap of going crazy, but the gap of the person performing and the person that actually is. They just don't have language for it. And without language, you can't move. And that is what I want to give you today, language. Not because language is the destination, but because it is the handle. And before you can open a door, you need to be able to reach the handle. Let me describe what it actually feels like to be bound, not philosophically, but in the body, in the daily experience, because the reason most people miss their own bondage is that the signals are ordinary. They feel like life. They feel like personality. They feel like maturity. And so they go unnamed. The first signal is the taxation of presence. There are spaces in your life where you feel, when you arrive, a slight interior adjustment. Something tightens just enough that you notice it, but not enough that you stop. You shift into a version of yourself that you know is not quite full. You arrive, but not entirely. And when you leave, there's a quiet exhale. You're like, ugh, you've learned to not examine that too carefully. Because if you did, you'd have to ask what it means that you needed. And most people think this is normal social calibration. And there's a form of context-appropriate adjustment that's healthy, right? I'm not describing that. I'm describing the experience where the adjustment is not about the room, it's about who you are allowed to be in the room. And where the self-editing is not courtesy, it's self-erasure. And where the quiet exhale at the end of the encounter is not relief from social energy expenditure, it is relief from having to be someone that you're not. The second signal is the invisible audit that runs on everything you say. Before the words come out of your mouth, there's this process. It's fast and typically unconscious, and it asks a consistent question. Is this safe? Is this safe? Is this how I'm supposed to talk? Is this the way I'm supposed to be? Is this how I'm supposed to? It's a hypervigilance of the internal invisible kind. Not safe in a physical sense, safe in the relational sense. Will this land? Will this be received? Will it cost me something? And based on the answer to that question, what you actually say is often a moderated, edited, softened, reframed version of what is true. And you do this habitually, and you do this so habitually that you stop noticing the gap between what's true and what you said. I want to be careful here because I am not describing dishonesty. Most bound people are genuinely trying to be good. The moderation is not malicious, it's protective. It's developed in response to real experiences where being unmoderated was genuinely costly, where working through things with the open mouth is almost like a death sentence. The problem is that the protection outlived the threat. The threat has changed or disappeared, but the reflex is still running. And now the protection has become the prison. The third signal is what happens when you stop producing. For some people, this is about work. For others, it's about relationships or being active in the community, spiritual growth or visibility, social media, etc. But the signal is the same. When the output stops, the anxiety starts. Not because the output is actually necessary, but for a long time, the output has been doing the work of telling you that you are acceptable and that you earned your place, that you're worth the space you're taking up, and when it stops, the accounting comes true. This is not ambition, it's bondage. Ambition is a person pursuing what is genuinely theirs because they're drawn to it. Bondage is a person producing to avoid the feeling that arrives when they stop. The distinction matters because people who are bound by production, they look from the outside like the most driven and motivated and successful people in the room. And they are celebrated for it, which makes the signal even harder to name. My phone keeps going off, so I'm glancing over there, so I'm going to put it face down. Why is it hard to name? Because the culture is consistently and constantly telling them that what they feel is the cost of success, not the evidence of distortion. The fourth signal is the relationship ceiling. There's a particular moment in close relationships where a bound person tends to stop. It's the moment where real disclosure would be required, right? where what is actually happening inside would have to be spoken. And instead of speaking it, the person finds a way to just say, just stay inside the boundary of safety. They go deep, but not quite deep enough. They are present, but with the margin held back. And the relationship has warmth and genuine affection, but it never quite arrives at the intimacy that both people sense is possible. And they cannot tell you why. They just know something in them does not fully arrive. The fifth signal. What is the fifth signal? Well, you know what it is. It's the absence of rest. Not sleep, rest. The experience of being in a space of stillness without the interior noise of accounting, without the background process of evaluation, justification, planning, defending, monitoring. Most bound people have never experienced genuine rest because genuine rest requires the absence of self-management. And self-management does not have an off switch if you've never located the identity underneath it. So these 5 signals are not diagnostic, and they're not like a checklist. They're a description of a texture of life. And I want you to sit with them as not as labels to apply, but as mirrors to look into, because the question is not whether these signals are present. For most people, some version of most of them are actively present right now. The question is, how familiar do they feel? Because familiarity is the one thing that can make a prison feel like home. If what I've described sounds like your ordinary week, I'm not here to alarm you. I'm here to name it, because naming it is the first movement towards something different. You can't reach for what you cannot see. You cannot reach for what you cannot see. And until the signal is visible, until you can see it clearly, you can't locate the source. And until the source is located, you can't move. And I want to talk about where we are culturally with identity work, because everybody wants to move, everybody wants to grow. And I'm not here to criticize, I'm not here to establish a pejorative language to bring attention to what I'm doing, etc. Because I think most people who are genuinely trying to get free are working inside a framework that structurally cannot deliver what it promises. And understanding why matters, because it determines what you reach for. We are living through an enormous cultural conversation about identity, about healing, growth, personal development, freedom. It's buzzwords galore. That conversation did not exist in the same form 30 years ago. The language of self-awareness, of inner work, of emotional intelligence, of personal development has entered the mainstream in a way that represents a real shift. And people are asking questions about themselves that previous generations were not equipped with language to ask. And honestly, it's extremely exciting and genuinely really, really good. But here's what I want to examine. The dominant architecture of that conversation is additive. The assumption underneath most of what is being offered is that you're a person who is currently insufficient, and the path to freedom is to add things, add discipline, add habits, add morning routine, add a healing practice, add self-knowledge, better relationships, the right framework, add enough in the right order, add core values, add identity, add understanding, add an understanding of your needs. If you do all this with the right consistency, and eventually the version of you that you are trying to become will click into place. You are not trying to become anything. That's the problem. Some of the stuff that I just rattled off and ran into is useful. And I'm not arguing against growth or discipline or practice or healing, but what I want to ask really is a more precise question about the architecture, because here is what the additive model produces at best. More functional version of the same fundamental confusion, a pretend version that seems in tune. A person who was managing their anxiety through avoidance learns to manage it through mindfulness practice instead. It's 1,085 days for me right now without 1 ounce of anxiety or stress. Yeah. The person that might be less avoidant, they are more functional. But the relationship to anxiety as something that must be managed rather than understood has not changed. The framework shifted. The architecture did not. The person who was seeking external validation through achievement learns that through personal development to seek external validation through the performance of self-awareness. They post about their healing online. And they measure their growth through other people's recognition of their growth. The content of the performance changed. The fact of the performance did not. And they live a pretty good life, you know. And I'm not saying that to shame those people. I'm saying that because the pattern is worth understanding. When the architecture of the solution is additive, you cannot escape the fundamental problem of a person who is building identity from the outside in. You're just building a more sophisticated version of the same structure. You're borrowing. The second thing I want to name about the current landscape is the ecosystem that has grown up around this conversation. I mean, there are people who have built enormous platforms and considerable income and significant cultural influence on the premise that they have the damn answer. That following their system, their framework, their process, their steps will produce your freedom. And some of what they offer is genuinely valuable. I want to say that. It's very valuable, genuinely. I want to say that plainly. But there's a structural problem with the teacher-centered ecosystems, regardless of the quality of the teacher. And the problem is this. In a teacher-centered ecosystem, here it is, the student's identity becomes relationally organized around the teacher. The teacher becomes the authority. The teacher's framework is the grid through which experience is evaluated. And then the teacher's language becomes the language through which the self is understood. And dependence rather than freedom is what the system quietly produces, not because the teacher intends to. They often do not intend to do this, but because the architecture rewards proximity to the teacher, not independence from them. That's how it happens. A person who is genuinely free does not need to stay close to the person who helped them get there. They take what is true, they embody it, and then they move. The teaching that produces freedom should ultimately make itself unnecessary. And it should be built to do that from the beginning. The third thing I want to name is the way that emotion has been positioned in much of this cultural conversation. There has been understandably a strong corrective emphasis on emotional awareness, validation, processing, intelligence, etc. And for a culture that was historically avoidant of emotional depth, I mean, this has been very, very valuable. People needed permission to feel things, right? They needed language for what was happening inside. And not everybody's a poet. That really mattered. But the corrective has, in many cases, overshot into something that I want to describe because it's subtle. The overshoot is the equation of emotional intensity with identity depth. The idea that the person who feels the most, who processes the most, who names the most, is the person who knows themselves most clearly. And that is not what depth actually is. It's just not. Depth is not the volume of emotional experience. Depth is the stability of identity in the presence of emotional experience. A person can be exquisitely, verbosely aware of every emotional current moving through them and still have no stable ground to stand on. In fact, the over-identification with emotional states is itself a form of bondage, masking, and false identity, where the person's sense of self is entirely determined by whatever they are currently feeling. And a self that is determined by its feelings is not more free. It's more subject to change, more reactive, more dependent on conditions being favorable than a self that is anchored in something that does not change. And this is the one that I want to be most careful with because it's easily misread. I'm not arguing against emotional awareness. I'm not arguing for suppression or detachment. I'm arguing that emotional awareness as a standalone practice without a stable identity that underneath it produces hyper-awareness rather than clarity. And hyper-awareness is not freedom. It is a more sophisticated form of being governed by conditions rather than residing in truth. And what I've just described, the very additive model, the teacher dependency dynamic, and the confusion of emotional volume with depth are not criticisms of individuals. They are descriptions of architectural problems in the current landscape. And the reason I'm spending time on them is not to position myself as the corrective. Most of you probably even thought about that. It is to give you a clear picture of what you've been working with so that what I'm going to offer next lands in the right context. Because there's a different starting assumption, and everything changes when you hold it. The different starting assumption is that you are not a project and you are not a construction that needs right materials added to the right sequence. You are not a problem to be optimized. You are a frequency, and freedom does not come from adding the right things to who you are. It comes from removing what has been placed on top of who you already are. That single shift in architecture changes everything. Because if you're building, then the work is always ahead of you. There's always another thing to add, another level to reach, another deficit to address. The work is never done because the logic of the model is additive and completion is not structurally possible. But if you're uncovering, then the work is different. The work is recognition, and recognition, when it is genuine, is immediate. It does not require accumulation. This is what I mean when I talk about identity as something that is recognized rather than constructed. Your identity is not something you build. It is something you've always had access to that has been progressively obscured by layers and layers of performance, adaptation, inheritance, and survival response. And the masks that I work with in my framework are not moral failures. They are intelligent responses to real conditions. A person who learned to perform competence in order to survive chaos developed that mask because it worked. But the mask is not the person. And the freedom is not in perfecting the mask. It is in recognizing what is underneath it. When I talk about resonance, I mean something specific. There are moments in a person's life when the distance between who they are performing and who they are actually collapses. Something is said or seen or experienced, and instead of the usual processing, there's just recognition. Instant, quiet, unmistakable, a kind of an interior yes that does not require argument. Those moments are not coincidences, and they are not emotional intensity. They're signals from the frequency that has been there the entire time. And the work of freedom is learning to trust those signals more than you trust the performance. What the Autonomy Commission, my group, our group, the group that I'm a part of, is built to do in everything from the individual conversations to the frameworks to the content to the courses is to create conditions for that recognition. Not to tell you who you are, provide opportunity for you to pick and select from a menu of who you'd like to be, to create enough clarity around who you are not, that what is actual can surface. This is a meaningful distinction. A teacher who tells you who you are is asking for a particular kind of trust that keeps you dependent on the teacher. A framework that helps you see your own distortion clearly enough that truth becomes undeniable to you is asking for a different kind of work that leaves you in possession of your own clarity. We want to shine the light for you. You have to look in the mirror. I want to give you a picture of what this looks like when it's working, not a performance of freedom, the actual texture of it. It looks like a person who can sit in a room where they are not liked, not understood, not agreed with, and remain steady. Not because they are suppressing the experience of being in that room, but because their sense of themselves does not require the room's approval in order to remain intact. They can be wrong and acknowledge it without the acknowledgement being a collapse. They can be challenged and engage the challenge without becoming the challenge. Their ground is internal, and internal ground does not shift when the external conditions do. It looks like a person who can work hard and produce genuinely and pursue things with full commitment and stop when the work is done. Not because they've lost their drive, but because the drive is no longer being used to outrun fear, right? They work from resonance rather than anxiety, and work from resonance has a different quality to it. It generates rather than depletes. It builds, it fills. It really overflows the cup. It's cumulative rather than compensatory. It looks like a person in a relationship who can be known, not managed, not performed at all, not impressed, known, who can bring what is actually happening inside without calibrating it for the other person's comfort, who can receive from the other person without the reception of being organized by the question of whether they deserve it, intimacy without transaction, presence without performance. It looks like a person who wakes up in the morning and does not have to remember who they are and who they're supposed to be today, not because their life has no complexity, but because the complexity is not being navigated from a place of self-protection. They move through it from a place of clarity, and clarity, once it becomes genuine, does not require maintenance. It is a practice that you have. It's not a practice that you have to keep up. It's a recognition you have already had, and that's the destination. And I want to be honest with you about the path to it, because I think people have been misled about what the path looks like, I'll be honest. The path is not linear. It does not proceed from lesson 1, 2, 3 in a clean sequence that you can track on a progress bar. It proceeds by recognition, which means it can happen fast in a single conversation when someone finally has language for something they've been carrying for years. And it can be slow in areas where the distortion is deeply defended, where the mask is tied to identity in ways that make seeing it feel genuinely threatening. And both are true. And the honest work honors both. The path is also not about becoming a different person. This is something that just needs to be heard, because a great deal of personal development literature is organized around the idea of becoming who you were meant to be, becoming the best self, becoming free. And I even used that language in the beginning because it felt like I was becoming. And there is something in that language that subtly reinforces the problem, though, because it places freedom at a distance and a future version of you that is not yet real. What I am describing is not becoming, it is recognizing. You are not trying to arrive at a self you have not yet become. You are trying to see with increasing clarity a self that has always been real the entire time. And that distinction matters enormously because it changes the quality of the journey. You're not climbing towards something. You're not trying to get there. You are here and you are clearing away from something. And clearing, when it happens at the right level, produces immediate relief, not the relief of accomplishment, the relief of coming home. And that is what I am after in this work. That is what every session in this series is going to be oriented toward. And we're going to look at the cultural moment, at the frameworks that circulate in this space, at the ideas and the ideologies, at the language, at the signals of bondage in daily life, at the specific ways identity gets obscured and the specific mechanisms by which it surfaces again, not to give you more to carry, to help you put things down. And if today, sitting here, something in what I have said has felt like a yes, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet recognition that something in here was describing something in you, I want you to pay attention to that. That recognition is not the lecture working on you. It's not James's wild and crazy verbosity giving you some energy. That is you recognizing yourself. And that is where everything begins. Well, it's been half an hour. This is James Tippins. This is Unbound, Freedom for Life. Let's set you free.